Please, everybody stand up.
So I want to talk a little bit about something that's almost a buzzword by now, single-page apps. I think it's kind of been overhyped a bit, and I just want to quickly, before I talk about the specifics, want to quickly define what I think single-page apps mean. So to me, everything that doesn't do full page reloads is a single-page app. So you have, a page where you don't click links and the whole page reloads, but everything kind of happens inside the page. And server interaction is only done with XML HTTP request, or AJAX as we used to say. So if you persist something to the server, you're actually using XML HTTP request or jQuery.ajax or something to do that, instead of sending just a form to the server. And front-end interaction is built using JavaScript, obviously. That being said, the question is that I find most interesting these days is, since it's so overhyped, should I really do it? Should I build a single-page app? And so what I'm trying to do with this talk is just give you a few reasons to do it, and then come up with a few reasons not to do it. And I'm starting with the good parts. So why you should probably build a single-page app. Let me quickly do something here. So the first reason is something that I'll call snappiness, and this is obviously a completely subjective term. It just means that the app somehow feels faster than you would than a normal web app, and this is obviously done by doing stuff asynchronously and not hitting the server every time you want to display new information. And this helps a lot with this snappiness. And obviously, that's what the A in AJAX stands for. The second reason is mobile apps and mobile web apps specifically. So I'm not talking about kind of these hybrid apps here. A mobile app in 2012 has radically different interaction models than we are used to with normal web applications. So you have stuff like swiping to do stuff, you pinch gestures, stuff like that. So it's not like we're just clicking links, hitting buttons, filling out forms like we used to. And so that's a pretty good reason to do it. And then, at least on iOS, you have this add to home screen feature where you can actually add a website to the home screen, and it turns into this separate container that is basically just a Safari, but it has its own process and stuff like that. And the thing is, if you're not building a single page app, you can still add it to the home screen and you can have this separate container, but as soon as the user clicks a normal link that's not built using JavaScript, then it will actually switch back to Safari, and that's kind of a bad experience. You can kind of fake around that, and if you look at something like jQuery Mobile, for example, that's like the ultimate fake around on this, because you're basically building a web application like you normally would, and jQuery Mobile turns it into a single page app, basically. So that's a pretty good reason. Offline access is also something. So HTML5 has these awesome APIs to do offline access. So you can specify a manifest that contains your specification of the files that need to be cached locally to be able to run the application without a server. And it's pretty tricky to do it right, but you can basically do it. And so if you're on mobile, for example, you usually have sketchy networks that may or may not be present. You know, I mean, conference Wi-Fi is one of these things that is pretty sketchy. It's been good so far here, but you know how it is. Sometimes at conferences the Wi-Fi is just non-existent after a few hours, and so if you are building an offline app, you actually have to have some ways of storing data. So if you're normally hitting a server to persist data, like, I don't know, your photos or something, you then need a possibility to store that on the client to be able to pull it back into the browser as soon as someone reloads the page and the network is down. So offline storage is a little bit of a tricky subject because there are like 3 different APIs that are all incompatible with each other, and the browser support is very weird with this. So the first one is DOM storage, which is just a very, very simple key value store. Then you have web SQL, which is kind of on the way out. And then you have IndexedDB, which is the new kid on the block. It's a document-based database, a little bit like modeled after something like CouchDB, and you can query data. And it's awesome, but it's also not supported in all browsers. So the situation looks a little bit like this. Hope it's big enough so that you can see it. And what this basically means is that in the end, DOM storage is the only thing that's available. And DOM storage comes with its own set of problems because it's a synchronous API. That means that it can be really slow on browsers like Chrome, where you actually have each tab running in its own process, and suddenly to save something into the database, you have to do inter-process communication, and that is slow in terms of if you want to pump in lots and lots of data in real time, it can be really a hassle. And IndexedDB is supposed to fix all that. It's an asynchronous API and it's much better, but it's not there yet. So if you're doing stuff with it, one good thing might be to look at Lawnchair, which is an awesome project by Brian. And it's basically abstracting all of that away. And this is just a very quick example. I'm not even going to explain to you. So you can basically create a database, and whatever mechanism is present in the browser will work. So the next reason is something that I call clear boundaries. So I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with this problem, that if you start bringing JavaScript features into your app, you're probably using something like jQuery because it's there in Rails from the beginning, and you start working with it, and everybody has its own style of writing jQuery code, and in the end you end up with this jQuery mess that's kind of spread out over maybe 20 files or so, and nobody knows how it really works. And I've been there a couple of times, and so that's not a very fortunate position to be in, and it's really hard to test, really, because you can most of the time you can only test it with end-to-end tests, which are hard to write in the first place and hard to get right in the second place. So that's not good. And also, it's been hard to maintain from the very beginning, and it doesn't get easier if your application grows to a certain point. And so there are these MVC frameworks, and there are a lot of them. Sometimes it seems like every developer that claims to be a good JavaScript developer has to have built his own or her own JavaScript MVC framework, and that's like, yeah, you know, it's really hard to find out what kind of framework to use. And I'm not going to tell you which one to use because it's also heavily depending on your use case. I'm going to tell you something about Backbone.js, and that's not because I love it so much, but because I've been using it for a few times and know how it works. So jQuery has basically 3 different areas. The first one is models and collections. The second one is views, and the third one is kind of routers and history, which deals with URLs and the history API in the browser. Models basically are like models in Rails, and they persist to the server. They can also persist to a local database in the client. That's perfectly possible. But you know, the usual way is just having a REST API that speaks JSON and persist and read data from that API. Views are rendering UI elements and handling UI events, so clicking on stuff, key presses, all that kind of stuff that we all know and use with jQuery. And they behave a little bit like view controllers in Cocoa, if you're familiar with iOS apps, for example. So that's a similar concept. Routers are a little bit like controllers in Rails, only that people are not allowed to say that for some reason. So the controllers in Backbone have been renamed to routers somewhere in the process. And the history API basically does the routing itself. So routers only specify it, and the history API makes sure if you hit a certain URL, then the code gets executed. It comes with its own event model, which is pretty cool. You can basically slap event support onto every JavaScript object and have it listen for events. That's pretty cool. And you know, this is just to show off my awesome OmniGraffle skills. That's not a very useful chart. I just love it so much that I have to put it in. That's like how the internals of a Backbone app work in the end. If you're really interested in seeing code, which is probably what you expected here, I urge you to look at 2 things. The first one is just the very simple Backbone.js example. And the other one is a totally awesome project by Adhere from Google, who did this to-do MVC project. And some of you may know this, but this is a collection of applications, or a collection of parts of a simple application that has been ported to as many as many MVC frameworks you could find, and it's still, they're still working on various parts, and you even have a vanilla JavaScript version that only even doesn't even use jQuery, and it's pretty awesome because you can kind of compare the different frameworks. And the last one is API uniformity. So if you're building an iPhone app, for example, you probably have an API ready anyway. And so you can use this API to both drive your iPhone app or your Android app, and also, or your Windows 8 app, and also the JavaScript version. And you only have to build that API once, so that's kind of nice. And you're able to serve all the clients with that. It's a pipe dream. It doesn't always work, but it's a good way to start, I guess. So reasons against a single page app, there are a few of them. The first one, very important, is search engines. The Google bot, in some cases, actually does execute JavaScript. So it's not as bad as it used to be. But still, JavaScript only won't probably fly if your product heavily relies on search engine optimization. It's not something that I would recommend to you anyway, but people do these kinds of things. So what can you do? One solution would be static landing pages, and you can have links in your footer of the application that just link to these static landing pages. It's potentially dangerous because Google is very strict about having content that's not really relevant for the user, but wants, that's basically just trying to trick Google into being able to index something. The other thing is you could also render important content statically and just send that to the client, and then kind of enhance the app around that content. People have been doing crazy stuff with it, but it's complicated. And you run into all kinds of problems with this. For example, code duplication. You suddenly need to have server-side templates and client-side templates at the same time, and they do the same thing. And there's currently no good solution to share templates between the client and the server. There's stuff like these two plugins, and it kind of works. It does weird things, compiling JavaScript templates and then rendering them into the browser. It's kind of weird, but it works. The Rails is not very well equipped for that. The asset pipeline in Rails 3.1 kind of made it worse because rendering templates in Rails itself and rendering templates in the asset pipeline is completely incompatible for some odd reason, and that doesn't make it better. So what about URLs? So there was this thing that Twitter had for a while. You've probably seen it at the time, which is called the hash bang. And if you've ever asked yourself why this is because Google decided, okay, we need a way to turn these hash URLs, which are normally used in JavaScript applications because it's only visible, so the hash part is only visible to the client. And so they came up with a solution that turns this URL into this URL automatically. So the Googlebot sees one thing and tries to ask the server for another thing. And this kind of loses the connection between the original URL and the content, and it makes you write a lot of extra code. And people are almost completely agreeing on that this was not a very good idea. So the solution to this is the push state API, which means that you can actually modify the URL in the browser without actually going to a different page. So that's pretty cool. And now you suddenly have URLs that you can send around and that the client, that the Googlebot can index, and you're fine. Browser support is okay-ish. The big elephant in the room obviously is IE10. I mean, it's a released product, but that doesn't mean that everybody's using it, unfortunately. So, yeah, it's kind of difficult. But if you're using Backbone, and many other frameworks have support for this as well, you can you can simply say push state true when you're initializing the history API, and it will use, for all its routing, it will use the push state API. And it falls back to hash URIs if that doesn't work. Rails integration is pretty straightforward if you don't need SEO, because you can simply do wildcard routing and do something like this. So you probably need an API namespace or something to do the API. And then you just have a wildcard route that routes basically everything to home index. Just a quick, if you need SEO, you're basically back to the point I said earlier. Then you're probably back to duplicating content, duplicating templates and stuff, and it gets complicated. And well, that's the pain because you're basing your business model on search engine optimization, I guess. So the second reason is, how much time do I have? Okay, wow. Leaving the Rails way, so this is really something that got me because I was used to so many conventions, and in JavaScript you have much less best practices. They're just in development right now as we speak. You have a lot less structure, so if you're building a Backbone app, for example, there's almost no way, so that you can build it any way you want. It's not telling you how to do things. And so you should prepare to read a lot of code from other people to see what's good and what's not good. And the document cloud source code, if you're into Backbone.js, is pretty awesome because it's the project that Backbone was extracted from, and it's completely open source. There are almost no good books. This one is still in early release from Adi Osmani. It's a good book. I've read it. JavaScript Web Applications is a so-so book, but it's also very helpful to understand the concepts. Then there's this book coming out from a guy that I have heard of. So that's my single plug here. You can also use Rails Backbone to get some set of conventions. But I kind of disagree with the conventions that the plugin does, but you know, that's how it is. You just deal with it. Also, one point I want to stress is that building a rich client application is inevitably more complex than a normal web application, and I can't stress this enough. And you be careful to not underestimate the work that is in building a rich client application. So you're dealing with stuff like request-based versus event-driven, stateful versus stateless. You're dealing with asynchronicity, which is always hard. Error handling gets more complicated. You know, if the network is down and your web app doesn't work, it's just that the page won't reload, or if you click a link, the page won't come up. But if you're doing stuff with Ajax, you have to be careful to implement all the error callbacks, because otherwise, you know, probably the user won't ever notice that the network is down. It's just not working anymore. So don't forget the unhappy path here. It's also a lot harder to test. You have more layers to test. You know, it's not just hitting the server. You also have to make sure that JavaScript is running and all that stuff. JavaScript testing best practices is also something that is only in development right now. We are getting there, but it's still hard. And asynchronicity is really hard to test. I can tell that from a lot of, you know, I can tell a lot of stories about this. Let me skip that. And, you know, the last thing, browsers. If you're building rich client applications, you're suddenly back into all kinds of weird issues with support for CSS3 properties, for example. Storage, as I told you, push state is not available in every browser. So you're basically back in, I don't know, 2002 or so, and you have to deal with a lot of different browsers and prefixes and stuff like that. So you really have to know your target audience. The conclusion basically is don't do it. And I mean this in a, you know, almost completely honestly. Don't do it now. So if you're building a startup and the whole thing you want to do is kind of validate your business case, I probably won't start with a single page app. It's except for you know, special business cases in the mobile space or something. Because it's it takes so much more time to get it right, and for validating a simple business case on a lean startup kind of model, it's probably a better idea to just build a simple web app. And you really have to test a lot. You have to test on mobile clients and stuff, and you have to know the limits of that technology. So what can you actually pull off on mobile browsers, for example? Expect a lot of difficulties. Debugging is hard at some times, and you know, it's difficult. So still, it's a lot of fun because you can do a lot of things you can't do in a normal web app. And yeah, that was basically it. Maybe we have time for one question or something. Thank you.
Hello. How do you handle model definitions? Like you have model definitions on the server and on the client side.
You mean in a big company?
No, in your project. You have in the client and you have in the server a model definition for, like, say, the user. You have it on the client as a model, right?
Yeah.
You understand what I mean?
No, not really.
You have a definition of a user model.
Ah, okay. Oh, okay. So That kind of depends. So the question was how to deal with different definitions. For example, you have a user model that's defined in Rails in the database, and then you have something like a JavaScript model, how you're handling the definition there, and then you probably have duplicates there. And the easiest answer is that, for example, in Backbone, you actually don't define a model. You don't have to, because it is just defined by the JSON that's coming back from the server. That being said, of course, if you're building a form, then you have to make sure that the information is somehow shared between these two. And obviously, you don't do that in a Rails way. But if you're building Rails, sorry. If you're building Rails views, there's no way, well, there are ways, but usually you're duplicating the information about the model there as well, because you're not automatically generating a form from model fields.